Welcome everyone into another episode of Zoom Action, KSR's basketball breakdown podcast. As always, I'm your host, Zack Geoghegan. My co-host next to me, Brandon Ramsey. Stephen Peak is behind the scenes, making all the magic, making everything look good. Today, we've got a great episode for you all. A little bit defense heavy. I think we were a little bit defense heavy on our last episode as well, but Kentucky's on a defense hot streak right now. Last two games, they've held their opponents under 65 points. First time all season they've done that. Happen to come against two SEC opponents. We don't have to talk about how bad their offenses were or are in general, but nonetheless, very positive signs for Kentucky going into Texas this weekend in Austin, where our friend Jack Pilgrim will be. We're going to go ahead and kind of jump right into it here. We're going to start with some blitzing action from the South Carolina game, where Kentucky defended pick and rolls a little bit differently than they have for most of the season. So, kind of something that I think we even mentioned it on the last episode, where I basically asked Brandon, why the hell are they not blitzing any of these ball screens if they're just going to get torched up in pick and rolls, pretty much relentlessly game after game? Well, we kind of saw a little bit of a change up. It wasn't an every possession type thing, but it was happening enough where I was able to send a text to our Zoom action group and say, hey, I noticed more blitz action. And Brandon said, yes, I've noticed it too. So it was a hallelujah type moment for all of us. But Brandon, I'm going to let you go ahead and just use your coach brain here. Dive into why Kentucky Firstly, is dive into why they did more blitzing against South Carolina and why it worked, and then jump into this play and kind of and show us exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think to answer your first question of why they did it against South Carolina, I think it's because they just don't have some of the dynamic playmakers that some of these other teams in the SEC have. It's a team that is prone to turning the ball over some. It's a team that isn't going to necessarily kill you from beyond the arc. It is a team that drives it pretty well and they can get downhill and get fouled. So I think maybe the thought process was let's try to get them going away from the basket. If you get out there and you hard hedge, you blitz, and you kind of get the ball handler moving away from the basket as opposed to letting them get downhill where we have a tendency to foul a little bit too much or we might overhelp and give up some uncontested catch and shoot threes. I think that was just kind of to mix up the rhythm a little bit. And let's face it, I think that even though that was certainly it was a must win game and in that moment, so you don't want to go too crazy, but you can experiment a little bit easier against a team like South Carolina. Then you're not going to go into the Tennessee game trying to experiment with a bunch of stuff. You kind of want to have your game plan set and know what you're going to do. You don't want to go into Florida or Alabama or Auburn or whoever it may be experimenting with things. But you have maybe a little bit more margin for error when you're playing the Gamecocks. And this first clip here,
South Carolina's 135 in Ken Palm offense, by the way, 135.
Yeah,
So
right. Yeah, it's not
very,
good.
very low. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's not good. And this first clip here, Amari Williams just kind of jumps out and ends up knocking the ball out of bounds. But it sort of sets the tone for the game, just like in the Tennessee game. Kentucky set the tone early on with Lamont Butler's steal on Zakai Ziegler and goes down and lays it up. This sort of set the tone for the game for Kentucky coming up right here, where Amari Williams jumps out there. Now, let's talk about a couple of things, Zach, because you mentioned, you asked me why have they not been doing this? Well, first off, like you easily could get called for a foul there. I mean,
he probably got lucky a little bit as
yes.
well.
So now you would have been 47 seconds into the game, and Amari Williams would have picked up his first foul 30 plus feet from the basket. That wouldn't make any of us feel super great. So again, that's some of the risk reward trade off with blitzing the ball screens is you're more susceptible to foul. He gets away with it here, knocks out of bounds. But then also there's two more things to think about. One being, well, I guess we already talked about one with the fouling, but look at where Amari Williams is right here. He's out to the half court logo. Well, what's Amari Williams best at? Defensive rebounding. Where does that take place at? Down here. So when you're all the way out here, now you're asking him to recover all the way back down here in order to start to do what he does best, which is defensive rebound. So again, I'm not saying that, oh, well, we got lucky against South Carolina. We shouldn't blitz the ball screens, by no means, but it is, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, where all of these defensive decisions, they don't just happen in a vacuum. You can't just say like, oh, well, playing drop coverage doesn't work, so let's try hard hedging. Well, there's a give and a take to blitzing the ball screens also, because you are more susceptible to fouling You pull your 7-footer away from the rim where you want him to potentially protect the rim a little bit, and certainly defensive rebound. So it worked out in this instance. I don't think it's a thing that you're going to see Kentucky do every game, but it was good. I think if nothing else, it almost was just good from a fan base standpoint, which ultimately doesn't really matter how we feel, but it was good of just like, okay, it was almost like a realization of, hey, we know things aren't working defensively, so here's us trying something else. And like it was almost just like a recognition of, all right, we know we maybe need to mix some things up every once in a while. So here we threw you a bone. We blitzed some ball screens against South Carolina.
Yeah, like you were saying, a lot of you can experiment more when you're playing a team like South Carolina too, because they're still right. They're ranked 78 in Ken Palm, which is not terrible. But it's not great. Yeah. And to your point, the reason they don't like to bring Amari out with on these blitzes is so he can defensive rebound. South Carolina is a terrible offensive rebounding team, so maybe there's another reason right there that you want to try and allow him to bring to step out and maybe be a little bit more aggressive. But also, this very much seemed personnel dependent because earlier in that same clip, you see Almanor go through a pick and roll, and he kind of does drop coverage on his own. So it was still kind of a hey, let's experiment, or it felt like a let's experiment with Amari, just maybe see what can happen with these blitzes. And we get another instance here late in this, I believe, still in the first half here. Brandon, if you want to
Yep.
go ahead and fire that play up, yeah. So about 8 minutes left, 9 minutes left here in the first half. We get another instance of Amari blitzing a ball screen here. We'll just let the play run and kind of see how everything lines up here. Again with Murray Boyles, and you see Amari immediately right on him, gets the ball out of his hands. And Amari's a good enough switchable defender that you're not necessarily worried about him having to stay on a guard or a smaller guy or anything like that. And he's so long and wide enough that it's going to make it tough for, especially once that guy picks up his dribble to get any sort of pass around. And you've got, like we said, talented South Carolina players out there where you can afford to do more of these things. But an immediate quick hit right here from Amari that forces them to get the ball up. Then you got active hands just all over the place. Shout out to Kobe Brea, who honestly has been just not perfect, but has been awesome on defense the last two games. Forces a steal here, and you get a kickstart, a fast break. So, Brandon, I kind of just laid it all out there, but anything you would like to add to this play?
Yeah, just quickly. First of all, you see Kentucky continue to be a little bit more active in the gaps, and that's something that we'll talk about when we
Hmm.
go into the Tennessee game too. Like the way that Jackson steps in here pretty aggressively is something that we haven't seen a whole lot of, and some of that's personnel dependent. Like 23 here is not a shooter for South Carolina, and not to mention, look, he's well outside the scoring area, but that allowed Jackson to get in there and stop some dribble penetration, and then here with this kind of downhill ball screen. This time the hard hedge almost turns into a switch. Like Jackson Robinson ends up having to kind of stay with
Hmm.
Colin Murray Boyles on the roll, but it got 23 again. A guy that's not super comfortable handling it. You jump out there and it just gets him to pick up his dribble. You could have forced a turnover right there because he's uncomfortable, but ends up giving it up. And then now you have a guy in number 5 or 15, I forget who it is, but it's Ugasuk for
Good
South
3 point
Carolina.
shooter.
Yeah, he just wants to shoot threes. He's thin. He's not a super comfortable ball handler. He just wants to shoot. So Kobe Brea is all up in his business, which is perfect. And he just takes the ball away from him. And the great thing, I mean, Kentucky is far from being a disruptive defensive team yet. I mean, they've been more disruptive against South Carolina and Tennessee, but it's not like they're forcing a million turnovers. It's not who they are. But it allows your defense to turn into offense because look at this. Like that's what Kentucky does best right there is shoot transition threes. And you don't get that unless you get this steal, which was started by Mario Williams and the blitz, and then Kobe Brea recognizing the personnel and getting out to pressure that guy, and then you get a high percentage shot for one of the best shooters in college basketball.
Yeah, like we said, this wasn't something that they were doing every position. I don't know if you looked if they have synergy data on how often they blitz or do anything like that of pick and rolls, but I don't think it was still that much against South
No,
Carolina. It felt like it was more in the first half than the second half. Part of that is maybe just having the lead late and you don't have to maybe resort to some of those things. Then in Tennessee, I felt like we really didn't see it much at all. Maybe just a handful of times where we saw blitzing coverage on that. I wasn't paying too much attention on my rewatch for that, but I don't remember seeing any of those moments that stuck out like they did in South Carolina.